right, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So this is December 2nd. I think it's the second night of our discussion of any Dharma talk. It's actually our third evening of practice. So we're here at Olympia Zen Center for our Rohatsu Sesshin. And so the question for tonight is, who is responsible? A little bit this comes out of some admonishment last night of leaving all the lights on in the house when nobody was using them. And so, but it brings up a very important question about who is responsible. And not just for the lights in the house. Who's responsible for homelessness? Who's responsible for gun violence? Who's responsible for poor medical coverage for people? Who's responsible for corruption in our government? Who's responsible for contaminated water? Who's responsible for climate change? Of course, you know, I could go on and on. These impossible situations we have facing us today. Who's responsible? Who's responsible for all this? It's a very hard thing to imagine, or to even accept, if you can, that we are all responsible. We're responsible for everything. So in our koan practice, we have the first koan, which is koan mu. A monk asked Joshu, does the dog have Buddha nature? Joshu answered, mu. Somebody answered mu. So that's the first koan, all our seeking after the experience of emptiness. But lots and lots of times we forget the second koan, which is really, to me, one that we should do first, before koan mu. And particularly privileged people in America in particular. So the second koan has to do with the man who would come to Dharma practice every night. And then he would leave. And then one night, he came to the Zen master and he said, 500 lifetimes ago, I was turned into a wild fox because I was asked a question, are we subject to causality? And I answered, no, cultivated minds are not subject to causality. And at that moment, I was turned into a wild fox for 500 lifetimes. So he asked the Zen master if he could please help him to return to human life. Because although he looked like an old man, he was actually a wild fox. So the Zen master asked him, are you subject to causality? Although the man asked, are we subject to causality? And the Zen master answered, we are not not aware of causality. And this question of causality is a tremendously important one, because as very much as privileged people, we think we can do what we want, and we feel we're not responsible for the condition of the world. And when we come to Zen practice, it seems to me that recognizing how we do in the world and what we do in the world is pretty primal, pretty important stuff. And that the realization of emptiness is very wonderful, but not so great if one becomes haughty and thinks one knows something after that, and feels that one is not responsible for the world that we are in, and is not unaware of causality. Because everything we do is connected to causality. It's an incredibly important thing to come to terms with and to understand in practice. Granted, we don't go out every day and say, well, I've got to go to the supermarket, and then understand, that we're putting fumes into the air, or we waste water. We do all kinds of things like that, all related to causality. So deeply important piece in who's responsible. So I had an experience in training when I went to Shohoji Temple. I mean, as you know, I was the only woman and I was the only foreigner. My Japanese language was marginal. And so I had a very hard time getting my point across sometimes if I wanted to say something, or I wanted to be able to have somebody to understand me. But I came in and I thought, this system that they have here is crazy. The Shuso had no time to study. None of us had any time to study. And yet we all had studying that we had to do. Shuso was getting ready for his ceremony, and he had huge reams of stuff that had to be memorized. And each one of the monks who was going to ask a question in the ceremony needed to memorize their part in the ceremony. And I had one of those also. And I didn't totally understand the Japanese entirely, so I had to memorize it by sound. There's no time to study. We got up at 4:30 in the morning and we went to bed about 9:30 at night. And so you had to spend your own time when you could. There were no breaks in the day. I was given a half-hour break after lunch for about 3 days because I was so exhausted. And the Godo Roshi finally said, okay, you can rest, you can have half an hour after lunch. That lasted about 3 days. But I came up with the great idea that instead of having 15 monks in the kitchen preparing the meals, why not just have those who were really preparing the meals and let the other monks go and study? Now, you have to imagine the kitchen was maybe 3 times the size of our Zendo, huge kitchen. And when, how many people really did it take to prepare rice gruel for breakfast? It was made the night before and it was in one pot. And of course, the pickles had to be put out and the other pieces had to be put together in the meal. But when 15 people are there to do that work, there's tremendous competition for certain jobs to do so that you look busy. because you know you are busy. So somebody would hustle to the sink and wash any remaining dishes or any, things coming from the cooking that needed to be done. Somebody else would sort of grab the bowls and take that territory, and tremendous, because you had to be busy. I mean, sometimes, you take one plate at a time into the dining hall, then come out looking very busy, walking like you knew that you were headed towards something. And so I had this great idea that, honest to goodness, if we were honest about it, we could let some of the monks study while the others were getting the meals ready. So I spoke to Goto Roshi about it, and he finally agreed that we could do that. And that lasted 3 days. Because it's just not the Japanese system. And it was not what the training was about. The training was to teach everybody to be responsible for everything that happens in training, everything that happens in practice, we are responsible for. So, I mean, even this evening, at the evening ceremony, the doshi was ringing the outside bell, but the rest of us were responsible to do that. The rest of us were responsible to support that. So we're responsible to get the books out. We're responsible for all of these, and everybody's responsible. So simply because somebody else is doing it doesn't mean that we are not still responsible. We're responsible to know that it has to be done and that somebody's going to do it. And if somebody else doesn't do it, then we do it. So that was a hard training for me to grok, to really get and to understand, because, we're so used to, in our American way of saying, okay, you do this while I do something else, and I won't have to worry about that. And that has not been the Zen training. So when we take that same kind of notion about responsibility for everything, we begin to see the universal connection of responsibility for the world that we are in. And if we truly look at it and try to experience one's responsibility in it, we realize there's so much that we absolutely cannot do. I mean, I cannot solve homelessness. I cannot solve climate change by myself. There's so many enormous problems our young people are going to face in this world. But we continue to exert ourselves in our practice. And in that exertion that we do, which is not true exertion, Dogen Zenji talks about exertion. And he says that exertion is no exertion, but that no exertion is true exertion, because we are truly doing this. We are doing this enlightened practice, and we're doing it for the benefit of all of the practitioners together. And if we think about the global problems that we have, our national problems and our global problems, it's going to take incredible exertion. And no exertion, there is no change. A little bit of exertion is a little bit of change. Great exertion, there is great change. And all of that exertion is no exertion. as Zen practitioners, we have to really truly realize that our own practice and how we are responsible for the entirety of it participates in great exertion in global understanding of what we face. Somehow, in thinking about just the enormity of the problems, somehow they are no longer separate from us. They are no longer, oh, it's that guy. Oh, it's the Republicans. Oh, it's the Democrats. Oh, it's gun-loving people. Oh, it's gasoline. Oh, it's the oil companies. That somehow gets removed from us when we accept that we are all responsible for the condition of this planet. The impossibility of addressing them individually gets washed away in the recognition of the universality of it. That it belongs to all of us. And so this is true in our practice at Sesshin, where we have this great opportunity to engage in some of the aspects of practice that we don't typically do and that we haven't done for a couple of years now. We're all a little bit rusty in everything, but we're doing pretty well nevertheless. But this type of awareness is essential to us to understand what needs to be done, what hasn't gotten done for the balance of ceremony, for the exquisite devotion of the ceremony. So we are not ignorant of causality. And truly, if we come to understand that, we are immersed in practice then. We are immersed in the communal organization of it. That is, we call Sangha. We are immersed in the support of the community, understanding that everybody is working to that same place of effort, same place of exertion, no exertion. And in that is a truly harmonious Sangha. Otherwise, some people get pretty frustrated. Those who are a little more seasoned in practice can get pretty frustrated when things just sort of fall apart because we aren't aware, we don't recognize that something isn't done to support the ceremony. And this practice, that awareness, teaches us the great universal awareness of our responsibility to the health of this planet. I know that R word, responsibility, is almost as bad as the C word, commitment. It's so almost poisonous to throw out into the atmosphere with people, because there's such resistance to it, because people fear that they will become absorbed in doing things that they don't particularly want to do. And so therein is the rejection of responsibility. And what I'm trying to say is that when we truly accept that responsibility, we take it on, we are relieved of a burden. We're relieved of the burden of it. Anybody have any questions tonight?
How are we relieved of the burden of it if we take on a responsibility?
Because there's no exertion. We enter no exertion, rather than the kind of exertion that is troubling. We are free in the action of doing. We are no longer resistant.
There it is.
If we fulfill our responsibility here, does that somehow translate to fulfilling a responsibility to the greater good, say, with regard to climate change in some degree?
Yeah, we become aware of what we personally then are doing that contributes to climate change, because we are responsible. How many cars are parked in our driveway here, in our parking lot? So we all participate in that. And so we become aware of the use of this, become aware of the use of the resources that create climate change. And we support others who are working more deeply on the problem. I mean, there are all kinds of ways then that we might take responsibility then. What we are doing is learning life lessons here, so that we create a wider field of awareness in the care of our lives and the planet and the community. Not just this community, but the communities that we move through every single day. It's really all Zen training is about, is to teach us to live well. To open our own, to open the mind field, M-I-N-D field, the mind field, to a richer vision of what this world is made of and what our part is in it. So in our chanting, we speak of the Dharma Kaya. And the word kaya is body. So we're talking about the Dharma body. And the Dharma body is all of existence, all of phenomena is the Dharma body. So there's not anything in existence that isn't the Dharma. And it is our practice to open that view wider and wider, that we begin to see that. You know, so we talk also about the relative and the absolute. And of course, we know that we are in the relative world. We work with the relative world and we work with the absolute. And of course, the relative world is this question of causality. But unless the relative world is manifesting the absolute, we have all this work to do until this relative world is lifted. And that is that slow, slow movement, that exertion point. I'm just using Dogen Zenji's word of exertion, that continual exertion for the manifestation of the realization of the Dharmakaya. If we stop exerting ourselves, if we stop working toward a better world, we can never change the relative. And of course, it begins with each one of us. It begins here. It begins in this Dharmakaya, each Dharmakaya, and all of the Dharmakaya. I mean, sometimes it's hard to truly realize this. We're sitting ourselves, we're on the cushion, and it seems like we don't reach into the world at all. We're just, here we are in this zendo, little zendo in Olympia, Washington. And it can feel like, not so much is happening, nor do we have any influence on the world at all. But we cannot see it. We cannot see that influence. You can't see awakening. You can't grab awakening. You can't hold that in your hand and say, oh, look, this is it. It's not a concept. So it's hard, very difficult to understand that all of the aspects of practice are awakening. Especially when we're all running around trying to find the books and we're trying to figure out who's going to ring that bell, and we're bumbling along. It's very hard to see that. And yet, it's a question of pure effort. And awareness. And responsibility for the totality of the practice. So the Kokyo introduces the chant, and then it's for us also to engage fully in the chanting, to enter the devotional piece of it. That's our participation, and it's our support of the Kokyo, and to create that, the completion of Sangha. Anybody else, anything at all? Any questions from anybody on Zoom? Beings of numberless, I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassed, I vow